Welcome. Thank you for getting here to Chatham House so early this morning. I'm Robin Neville, Director of the Institute. I'm delighted to welcome David Cameron, leader of the Conservative Party, and his shadow security team to Chatham House for the release of their Green Paper on a resilient nation. Now, this is part of a process, I think, that's been ongoing for some time, and started with an earlier paper that was chaired by Dame Pauline Neville-Jones, Shadow Security Minister, on an unquiet world. And I think there's a little doubt that with all that we've seen in the intervening, 2.5 years since that paper was released, actually also here at Chatham House, and especially with the events that took place even over the holidays, this remains a dangerous world in which threats are changing and morphing themselves into ever more complex shapes and forms. And in that context, being able to be resilient and adaptive is particularly important. So we look forward to the thoughts that we'll hear today in the paper. In terms of process, I can just say this has to be a relatively short meeting because David Cameron and others in his team need to get to their constituencies today. We will break at 8:45, and I will ask all of you to please remain in your seats when we break. And David Cameron is going to do the introductions, hand over to Dame Pauline Neville-Jones, and moderate the questions with you in the audience so we can get the most out of the meeting this morning. In any case, having said that about the process, please make sure your mobile phones are off if any of you have them. David, we're delighted to welcome you here to Chatham House. Let me hand over to you to run this meeting.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you everyone for coming this morning. I think it's right at this meeting to start with a few words about what's happened in Haiti. Reading about the death toll is one thing, but the scenes that we've all seen of the suffering, the scenes from the hospitals in Port-au-Prince, what has happened to people in that country, parents who've lost so many children they can't bury them, children who've lost parents and have no home, these are scenes that we must never forget. And our modern world is going to be tested in how we can respond and how we can help in the emergency phase, but also how we help to rebuild that country. Britain is an incredibly compassionate and generous nation, and I know the British people will respond in all sorts of incredibly generous ways, and I'd encourage everyone to do so through the Disaster Emergency Committee that has been established. For our part in the Conservative Party, we will do everything we can to encourage people to help, and we'll do everything we can to support the government in everything they do to coordinate our relief and to make sure that supplies and emergencies get through to that country. And in the meantime, I know that everyone here will want to say and think how our thoughts and prayers are with all those people who've suffered so much in that country over the last few days. It is good to be back at Chatham House. 2.5 years ago, Pauline Neville-Jones and I were here to launch the report from the Conservative Party Policy Group on national security. And today, we're here to explain how we would apply those ideas in government. It's our plan for a world where there is no neat split between domestic and foreign policy. A world where droughts in the Arabian Gulf can spark terrorism and civil war. Where an outbreak of flu in Mexico can trigger a pandemic which races across the whole world. And where cyber attacks aren't just threatening companies, but also entire countries. This is the world we're in today. But here in Britain, we still look at this changed world through the lens of institutions that haven't fundamentally changed since the end of the Cold War. So we've got a Defence Department which isn't really equipped to deliver homeland security. We have a Development Department which has been giving more money to the world's fastest growing economy than to war-torn, poverty-stricken, drought-hit Yemen. And we have a Foreign Office which, despite our historic links with the region and the threads that run through our present problems, has simply not paid enough attention to the Gulf states. We cannot go on like this. So today we're setting out in detail our plans for a proper national security approach. Let me be clear about this approach. It is not some sort of rebranding exercise, a nod towards new thinking, an attempt to sort of paper over the cracks while time slips away. I'm talking about one of the most radical departures in security policy that we have seen in decades. doing away with the disconnected policies of the present and putting in place a new connected approach for the future. Part of that, but only part of it is about machinery of government. Now, we were the first party to call for a National Security Council. We were the first party to suggest a security minister. And we're the only party that has said we need a full-time national security advisor. Over the past few years, there has been some movement towards a more joined-up system, but it's not gone anything like far enough or fast enough. So with these plans, we will set up a streamlined and decisive National Security Council, which will meet from day one of a Conservative government and serve as a de facto war cabinet for the duration of the Afghanistan campaign. The Council will have its own staff, its own subcommittees, a full-time national security advisor, and the power to develop cross-departmental budgets for national security. It will be responsible for all decisions on national security. It will oversee a long overdue strategic defence and security review, and it will plan ahead for the future problems that we might face. But this isn't just about machinery, or even mainly about machinery. This is about a different method of how we do things. Take the way we handle threats from abroad. For a start, we need to do much better at stopping wars from ever starting. And that means really focusing on the causes of conflicts, and then joining all of those things together to make sure that DFID and the Foreign Office deliver a really tied-up, progressive approach. We've also got to think through much more carefully whether Britain should get involved in a foreign conflict, and if so, how to cope with the consequences. And then if we do intervene and send troops to fight in a foreign country, there should be a proper reconstruction force ready and waiting to deliver a stabilisation strategy as soon as the fighting stops. The same thinking also applies to the way we handle threats here in Britain. So there's not much point in having tougher laws to deport people who are a threat to your country if at the same time you don't have a proper border police force to stop unwanted people from coming in the first place. There's not much point in saying that the military need to be more closely involved in emergency planning if the police and the fire services don't know exactly how many soldiers they can count on when the crucial time comes. And as Pauline and Saeed Avasi have argued so powerfully over the last few years, if we're serious about stopping extremism, we've got to make sure that our own anti-terrorism legislation doesn't clamp down on the very freedoms that we're trying to defend. But again, it's not just about the people and the places which are a threat to us. It's also thinking about the kinds of things that could go wrong. We need to plan for pandemics, for energy crises, for water stoppages, and in particular, for what I believe is a growing cyber threat. Now, we know there are hundreds of thousands of cyber attacks and cyber crimes against British business every year. Against government and the public sector, there may be many, many more. As technology and computers and the internet become bigger and bigger parts of our lives, the effect of cyber warfare will become more pronounced. You only have to look at the so-called Clickskrieg against Estonia in 2007, which crippled the government and the banking sector and almost brought the entire country to a halt, for a sign of how serious a major attack could be. I want Britain to be prepared and proactive and ready to deal with all kinds of cyber attacks. So today we're announcing plans for a new cyber threat and assessment centre to provide exactly that. So new machinery, new methods, a new way of thinking about national security that I believe will lead to some genuine changes as I've described today. But I believe there's also another key ingredient of a successful national security strategy. And that ingredient is trust. We have to take people with us and make sure that people trust the system. But over the last few years, this has gone badly wrong. It is hard to overestimate the damage that that second dossier did to our political system. It made people suspicious of something they should frankly always be able to rely on. Let me be clear. The Prime Minister should determine whether intelligence assessments should or should not be published. But political advisers should not be permitted, and under our plans will not be permitted, to change intelligence assessments, and any publication of an assessment should only be done by the Joint Intelligence Committee with the express clearance and approval of the Joint Intelligence Committee. And we will end the culture of spin by making sure that decisions about national security are taken formally, not on the sofa, but round a table with all the right people around that table. In the end, though, there is only so much you can do to create a watertight system. So ultimately, the important thing is about the people that you hire. And if you hire responsible people, people that you trust, people who want to lift politics up rather than stoop down to its lowest level, then you have your best guarantee against dodgy dossiers. So the changes I've set out today will fix a lot of the problems that we've seen in recent years. A failure to weigh carefully the consequences of intervention and to plan for the aftermath. A failure to equip our forces properly when we send them into harm's way. A failure to harness all the disparate resources of government so they pull together rather than pull against each other. And above all, a failure to tackle domestic and foreign security issues in the round. It is a big cultural change, and a change that I want to start from day one of a Conservative government. Thank you very much indeed for listening. Now I'm going to hand over to Pauline Neville-Jones. Pauline.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everybody. This is rather a sexist lecture, and I hope you can see it.
I'm sorry about that.
David has outlined the key problem that this country faces, I think, and he's given several descriptions of it. And it amounts really to poor government in foreign affairs and security policy. And it's not something new, it's something we've experienced for 10 years. But at a time when, as he said, day after day, the world is really becoming increasingly complex, turbulent and uncertain. And that's an analysis that we have in a bigger document that also accompanies the one that you have already. Poor government really can actively damage this country's interests. Well, the sofa-style government that became the hallmark of New Labour means that departments and agencies can be bypassed almost entirely, neglecting their expertise and knowledge. And I think that the Foreign Office is, unfortunately, a primary example of that, and this is something we have to change. This is also a government which has been wedded to some of the structures of the Cold War, and departmental silos mean that policies tend to be drawn up in isolation, and they're not adequately coordinated, and departments fail to work together. And this can't be right when there's no distinction between foreign and domestic policy, and when a greater number of departments and agencies have to work together on the front line, both at here and abroad. Now, having said all that, it's certainly the case that progress has been made in recent years, and that's largely, I have to say, because of learning on the ground. Our servicemen and women, and our diplomats, and our security and intelligence staff, our emergency services, all of these people are immensely talented and hugely capable of adapting to the challenges they face, and they have many good ideas. But too often they have to work against or are not helped by the system, and this is the thing that we want to try and change. And I give you a little anecdote from personal experience. When I was head planner in the Foreign Office in the mid-1980s, my staff wrote a paper on Yugoslavia, which concluded that the country was ripe for internal breakup and conflict. And we pointed in that paper to Bosnia as one of the most sensitive of the republics. I have to tell you, my civil service bosses dismissed this paper on the grounds that, though the analysis was very good, it was a blinding flash of the obvious, and in any case, the Soviet Union would never let it happen. So we put this paper back in the cupboard, and the wall fell 5 years later. And what I mean is we have to think ahead. Now, we might have been able, I think, to save the international community a great deal of misery if we'd taken the danger of bloodshed seriously rather earlier than we did. And that's what I mean about actually developing in the centre of government a strategic culture. Because, when we talk about the word unpredictable, it's often an excuse for what we actually failed to foresee. And it isn't a good excuse. And we've had, as I say, a series of conflicts, Bosnia, Kosovo, 9/11, 7/7, and all of these, to some extent, at any rate, could have been anticipated to a greater degree than they were. And if we look at the context we find ourselves in today, a fiscal crisis of very significant proportions, and also major shifts taking place in the global balance of power, it is going to be one in which the UK, as a medium-sized country, will find it harder to maintain its influence and advance its interests over the years. And so a capacity to anticipate events and to look ahead, and by doing so to give us options to avoid conflict and instead secure the national advantage, there is a methodology that we need to pursue, and that's why there's such a focus in the paper, and it has been noticed, I observe, on building capacity for preventative activity. But to undertake that, we need, as I say, to develop a capacity for strategic thinking, and that's why we will establish the National Security Council. And the aim is that it should foster a culture of forward-looking and cross-departmental working to achieve common goals. And it will also be underpinned by what has come to be known among the experts, and I hope this is readily understood, the so-called all-hazards approach. That's to say, an approach which recognises the links between different security challenges, and one which recognises that security these days is not just about the state, but about the good functioning and the well-being of people, society, and the economy. I mean, just think for a moment of the looming energy crisis. The energy underpins every aspect of life, yet Labour have failed to secure reliable contracts and ensure that there is enough domestic generating capacity, or indeed ensure that there is strategic storage in adequate proportions to get us through emergencies. And it's not surprising, therefore, that prices are going up and the people are getting worried. This is the kind of area of policy, and energy is certainly part of our security, where we ought to be able, by governmental action, to set a framework to ensure that the nation's interests are safeguarded. Now, clearly, there are some areas where government itself must do more. David's spoken about border security and the military contribution to homeland security, which at the moment, you know, is declaratory. It isn't necessarily reliable. And we've led on both of these aspects of thinking. But there must also be a more systematic approach to securing our critical national infrastructure, not only our energy supplies and the grid, our food supplies, our computers. David mentioned the cyber threat. And that's also why we're forming a new national resilience team. Now, as David said, it's not just about new machinery, it's about new methods and about new way of thinking about national security. And government can provide the best structures possible, and it can provide, I would say, the best insurance policy. That's what it should aim at. But no government can really provide total security by itself. We need to be honest with the public about that. David spoke about the importance of trust in government. This is an all-important prerequisite for involving individuals, communities, and businesses in building their own security. And I think government needs to be more open about the nature of the threats we face as a country, and that's why we're going to strengthen the Intelligence and Security Committee, why we will provide advice to the public about what they can do to prepare for and respond to emergencies themselves. Individuals, I believe, in this country can and do wish to make an active contribution. The terrorist threat is just one example of what we face, and I have to say, and I'm glad to be able to say it, that the agencies are doing a good job at countering it. But ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, it is a battle for ideas that's at stake, and that takes place within society. We promote our values abroad, but is that compatible, we have to ask ourselves, with being known around the world as an incubator of extremism and an exporter of terrorism? We have to do something about that. Strong communities are resilient to terrorism and extremism, and we are one nation and should be proud of our values. And that's why we need a national integration strategy which gets people to learn English when they come to this country, promotes democratic values and a sense of shared history as a context for a shared future. And we should bring about the conditions in which the majority stands up robustly against the tiny minority of extremists, whatever their hue. But we achieve just the opposite, if we destroy fundamental rights and freedoms in the name of security. And I spend quite a lot of time in my capacity as Shadow Security Minister in the House of Lords, trying to ensure that a proportionate balance is struck between security and liberty. This is absolutely vital, it seems to be, to our national identity and values. And I think that if we are more open with the public about the challenges we face, the better will be the balance that we're actually able to strike between these two requirements, security and liberty. I think, if I might say so, that Labour have made the mistake of seeking to protect us against each other instead of creating conditions in which we trust one another. What has happened, I have to ask, to the traditional British public spirit? We need to revive it. I think it's ludicrous that during the recent bad weather there has been a suggestion that we should not clear the pavement in front of our houses for fear of taking responsibility. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that our society will be freer, safer and more cohesive if we rely less on the state and more on each other. So, in addition to restoring a strategic capacity to government and using our national instruments in a sustainable way, we will place emphasis on a self-reliant society. And that's the approach of the Conservative government to national security, to be strategic, sustainable and self-reliant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pauline. Thank you very much, Pauline. My apologies for the lectern. Great that we're also joined by Liam Fox, my Shadow Defence Secretary, Chris Grayling, Shadow Home Secretary. William Hague is here in spirit, but is campaigning in the north of England, and Andrew Mitchell, who's my Development Secretary, who's been asking some very good questions on the response in Haiti, is currently in Birmingham, but is also very supportive of everything that in the document today. Questions? If people could identify their name and organisation, and I think there's probably a roving microphone. There is. Gentleman in the front here.
Nick Cecil from the Evening Standard. Will the Met Police remain the main counter-terrorism force for Britain? And it's somewhat surprising that Andrew Mitchell is not here. Is he fully signed up to this document?
Yes, on the point about Andrew Mitchell, yes, absolutely. And if you go back to the excellent development green paper that he and I launched together, you'll see a very kind of straight and direct line between what is said in that paper and what is here, particularly about the stabilisation and reconstruction force. This is an idea that the development team are extremely keen on. To anyone in the development community who's sort of worried that this in some way might abuse the development budget, I would say that's absolutely not the case. We will meet the target of 0.7% of GNI under the OECD definition. What this is about is just making sure that our effort is properly joined up and that we're thinking about how to deliver security and stability, which in many ways are the absolute bedrock of development. I mean, I'm very taken by the works of Paul Collier and all the things he's written about, if we want to get development going, actually peace, stability are the absolute foundation of reconstruction. I was talking to Andrew literally just before coming onto the stage here about some of the things that we are pushing for in terms of response on Haiti. On the issue of the Metropolitan Police, let me point, as they say, having a dog and barking yourself. So, Chris, over to you.
The answer to that is yes, it will. And I'm particularly clear that although there are challenging times ahead across the public sector, one of the things we have to ensure, with the Olympics coming up in 2012, that we do not disrupt our counter-terrorism machinery, and the Met particularly is in the front line of the efforts against the terrorist threat, in a way that could jeopardise the preparations for the Olympics and jeopardise Olympic security. So we have no plans to take the lead for counter-terrorism away from the Met.
One of the ways to think about this is just to make sure you've got the right team of people sitting around deciding policy. The policy then, it may have implications for the Met or for soccer or for what's happening in DFID or the Foreign Office, but you're trying to take off the sofa and put into the right forum the people who should be coming together to consider national security in the round. I think it also helps the working of number 10 Downing Street vis-à-vis the Foreign Office and other departments. Instead of having a Prime Minister who's on the sofa endlessly interfering, actually you're sitting around and deciding these things together as a team, which I think is extremely important. Next question. James.
James Tucker from Telegraph. You've mentioned the National Security Council coordinating cross-departmental budgets. Could you say a little bit more about how that would work? And at a time when you acknowledge that most departments are going to be facing fairly deep real terms cuts, are you entirely happy and convinced that Defence Secretary Fox and Home Secretary Frayling will be willing to give up some slices of their fairly hard-pressed budgets to a central pot run by the Cabinet Office or whoever it is?
Let's, I mean, first of all, everyone in the Shadow Cabinet absolutely knows that we are facing an unprecedented fiscal crisis. We've discussed this as a team. Everyone understands that very difficult decisions on spending will have to be made. We've been very frank about this and said that, you know, public spending has to be reduced. And George, quite rightly yesterday, said that some of that work needs to start very early on. You've got to get on the path to restoring a sense of fiscal sanity in this country. It seems to me there are two ways of trying to do this. One is you could say, well, we're going to try and combine all these budgets into some vast national security budget. I don't think that works. The other way, the current way, is things are very much in a silo. And you can meet and make decisions, but actually nothing follows from those decisions. So what we're saying is that there will be times where, because of the national security considerations and because of the work that's being done, you need to pool budgets, you need to form common budgets to pursue a common enterprise. And it seems to me coordinating that through a National Security Council where you discuss and debate these things is the right way of doing it. Will the barons of Whitehall battle hard to maintain their favoured projects? Of course they will. That's what happens in a civil service. But if you have a team of ministers sitting around a table that share a national security vision, that have a national security strategy, will they actually be able to make sure that we meet the threats by bringing together development, aid, defence and foreign affairs? Yes, we will. I think the Yemen's quite a good example. The point I made in my speech, that we're still spending more on aid to China than we are to the Yemen, that's not very sensible on national security grounds. And a team of people meeting together, thinking through national security, it would lead to different outcomes and different ways of spending money. We are all in it together, as they say, right at the back.
Hi, this is Teresa from Phoenix TV, a Hong Kong TV company. As you're speaking of the cyber threats, I was wondering how to react to the Google thinking about pulling out of China. So if there is such kind of company in UK and facing the kind of situation in China, would you support this kind of decision? Thank you.
Well, my reaction to that would be it's a decision for Google to make. They obviously thought very hard before going into China. They took a lot of criticism at the time. But they've decided that what is happening now is inappropriate, and they've decided to withdraw. That's their decision, it's a matter for them. To me, what it just points up is the scale of the cyber threats that we face. And as I said in my speech, it's not just companies. I remember meeting with leading politicians from Estonia and listening to what actually happened to their country during the Klickskrieg and finding it truly chilling what it is possible now to achieve. And so, again, if you think from a national security point of view, are we doing enough to combat cyber terrorism? No, we're not. This is something that does fall slightly between departments. It's a foreign affairs concern in some ways. The threats are coming from overseas. It's a defence consideration because it can disable parts of our defence industry.
And Home Office.
It's obviously a Home Office issue. Thank you very much. You know, and so that's why if you sit around together and think, right, what are the threats we face, you come up with a bigger answer on that. Pauline, do you want to add on the Google point?
No, but I do think that what it does demonstrate is that this issue is both a matter of security, it's also a matter of freedom of liberties, and that's what's at issue in China. But also, I would say, and this hasn't been mentioned, there's a whole area of crime that we also need to deal with, because that's a serious and growing threat, and we have no methods in this country effectively dealing with it at the moment.
Yeah. Very good. Right over here.
Emil Kirias from Liberal International, originally from Macedonia, a region that Pauline mentioned very vividly. Strengthening national structures is extremely important, but addressing the threats of the 21st century could be done through more EU or less EU, and why?
Well, we think the right way to address threats is to work through the institutions we have and make the best of them. We absolutely believe that NATO is the cornerstone of our defence, and while we're at it, we do support Macedonian membership of NATO, get that on the record. We think that NATO is the cornerstone of our defence, and we set out very clearly in this paper where and when it's appropriate to have greater EU coordination, and that's chiefly when NATO does not want to get involved. Liam, why don't you come in on that point?
Well, it's using, as David says, all the institutions that we're involved in. That's using NATO, our special relationship with the United States, the European Union, the influence we have in the Commonwealth, and all the other levers that we have as a country. We mustn't simply look to a single method of having influence when it comes to the ability to diffuse problems before they become critical.
Very good. Sir.
Michael Goldfarb, globalpost.com, the American news website. Leaving aside how decisions are reached, whether on the sofa or around a cabinet table, 3 crises that this current government faced, the bombing of Belgrade, the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, and the ongoing war in Afghanistan, how would a Cameron-led government substantially have differed, or if not, in similar situations going forward? How would you be slightly different or the same from the current government?
I think it's a very good question. Let's sort of take them in reverse order. I mean, if we look at Afghanistan, I think looking back, it is now quite easy to see that we went into Helmand province with 3,500 troops. There are currently now 10,000 British troops and about 20,000 US troops. And we now think we've got about the right force density to deal with an insurgency. So I would argue that in Afghanistan, and also with Iraq, there was a serious planning failure. And proper planning comes, I think, from having a national security approach where you do think through, right, what happens after the soldiers go in and kick the door down? What is the development response? What is the post-reconstruction plan? And that brings us to the idea of the stabilization force, where actually you are much more quickly building the schools, digging the wells, after you've actually knocked out the insurgents. So I would say Afghanistan and Iraq, clear failures of pre-conflict planning, clear failures of planning for the post-conflict age, particularly with Iraq. There was also a major failure in the way the public was taken into the government's confidence and had the situation explained, as we point out with the reference to the dodgy dossier and the way that intelligence worked. On each occasion, I think it was right in 2001 to go into Afghanistan, to get rid of the Taliban regime. I supported that. I think it was the right decision. But I think we can all see, and you absolutely sense, I've been to Afghanistan in each of the last 4 years, there was a moment, particularly after the Iraq invasion, when the NATO powers took their eye off the ball on what was happening in Afghanistan. And you can absolutely see the failures that took place there. So I would say on each occasion, it's not necessarily that we disagreed with the decision that was taken, but you could see a failure to plan beforehand, a failure to influence afterwards, a lot of which I would argue flows from not having a joined-up national security approach. Gentleman in the red tie.
Thank you. Lionel Zeta from the European Azerbaijan Society. Lady Neville-Jones mentioned energy security. I wonder, Mr. Cameron, if you and your team are aware of the degree to which the Russians and the Chinese are busy buying up all of the oil and gas in Central Asia and the South Caucasus region.
The short answer is yes, and we'll be producing an energy green paper very shortly, where we've done a huge amount of work to really go through the information that we have on energy security. Because in some ways in this country it's been sort of falsely put that the choice is, well, do we get on and build nuclear or not to deal with the energy gap? And the truth is the energy gap is coming down the road much faster at us. And if you read the government's own paper, they're pretty much planning for power cuts in 2017, which is before nuclear comes on stream. And we need to answer that question now, and we'll do that in full in our paper. We've also been making the point pretty consistently over the last few years about the fact we don't have enough storage in this country. We have gas storage for, say, 14 to 16 days, compared with more like 100 days in Germany, I think 120 days in France. So we do recognise the dangerous world in which we live in terms of energy security, but it's something that Liam has written about a lot, and Pauline as well. Perhaps I'd like to join in. Pauline, do you want to go first?
Well, you're quite right to draw our attention to what's going on in what's popularly known as the stans, because it is certainly the case that I think that Europeans collectively actually have failed to secure their interests in that area in the way they might have done. And there's been too much argument about pipelines and not enough focus on the need actually to secure contracts. So that brings me to a point, I think, that we do need to bear in mind, that the FCO in its priorities needs to have our energy interests right up at the top when it does its work and in its postings.
Lim, don't you have
Well, there's no area that's a better example of why you have to have cross-departmental cooperation than energy security. If you want a strong energy security policy, you've got to have diversity of supply at home. You've got to recognise where there are regional problems developing which may cause interruption of supply from abroad. You've got to be ensuring that you've got the mechanisms for safe transport and protection of supply. These require total cross-departmental cooperation, and it does relate to the previous question. We've had a tendency to wait until we've got flashpoint problems rather than seeing these as regional issues, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's what's happening in the stands. We must have a much more geostrategic approach to the problems that we face and not wait until we get individual crises looming.
Which also leads to the point I made about the Gulf, because it is striking how many people in the Gulf states do say, just in the last decade, the British government has underplayed the importance of this relationship. Fantastic historic relationships, fantastic trading relationships. Huge numbers of people in the Gulf states living in the UK and vice versa. And yet, have we given this area enough attention? Almost everyone there would say, no, we haven't, and we agree with that, and energy security is one part of why that's so important. Lady standing by the wall. I'm going to take 2 more questions. I think we've got time for.
Thank you, Kim Vitucci, Deutsche Welle. My question is also to do with the Western Balkans. This was mentioned, and you said you supported NATO membership of Macedonia. What about the rest of the region? And EU enlargement, too. I think you do support, but how fast do you think should it go? Should it happen? And what will you do if you are in government to ensure it does happen? And what are the risks if it doesn't, if there are excessive delays?
Well, we're in favour of EU enlargement. We think that the EU needs to develop in the right way in terms of not endlessly drawing new powers unto itself, but instead to be a wider, more flexible community. But one of the areas where we're most enthusiastic about the European Union is actually enlargement, not only because by bringing countries in you create a force for democracy, for stability, for trade, for progress, but also the prospect of EU membership has been a great driver for development. And it's no good holding out the prize of EU enlargement if you can't actually achieve it. So how far can it go? Well, as far as we're concerned, that we shouldn't put a limit on EU enlargement. We are in favour of a European Union that, effectively stretches right across our continent. We're also strongly in favour of Turkish membership. Clearly there are things where countries have to qualify and all the rest of it, but we would get strong support from EU enlargement, including the countries of the Balkans. Let's take one more question.
William Morris, can I ask about the budgetary? Implications of this? The Foreign Office budget, as you know, is already being squeezed by some 15 to 20% this year, which affects international civilian missions, which I'm talking about. If the national health budget is ring-fenced and the development budget is ring-fenced, that implies that the Home Office budget and the defence budget are going to be squeezed much more sharply. Can we ring-fence the national security budget as well, or are we going to have to manage with very substantially reduced resources in this area?
No, these budgets are not ring-fenced. I mean, let's be frank, we're going to have to work out in this country how to do more for less. And I would argue it's not, can you afford to have a national security approach? I would say we cannot afford not to have a national security approach. Particularly at times of tight budgets, we should be asking more and more, how do we get Foreign Office, Home Office, development, defence, how do we get them to work together effectively? We don't believe that what we're setting out in this paper is a sort of laundry list of expensive pledges. Far from it. We actually think that these are things we can do within the existing budgets by better coordination. And there are 2 ways to approach this. You can either, as the Prime Minister is doing, appear on programme after programme and claim that public spending is going up, when anyone with half a brain can see that public spending is not going up. The only possible way you could say it's going up is because we're spending so much on debt interest. So everyone knows public spending is going to have to come down. Much better to start to tell the world, to tell the civil service, to tell all the departments that that is what is going to happen, and we're going to have to get more for less. Now, in business, people don't take the view that reducing expenditure is somehow the end of the world. They see it as a challenge. How do we improve our service while cutting our costs at the same time? That is exactly what we're going to have to bring to the business of government. And we need to be frank with people about that right now. I'm sorry to draw this meeting to a close. I have to go and address the Women's Institute in Chipping Norton. And as you all know, you keep the Women's Institute waiting at your peril. So with that, thank you very much for my team. Thank you particularly to Pauline and all the work that she has done since joining the team 4 years ago to bring this process to a conclusion. And thank you everyone for getting up so early and coming this morning. Thank you very much indeed.